My mother raised her glass at midnight and announced my pregnancy to a room full of people I wasn't ready to tell yet, and I felt my entire body go numb while the countdown noise was still echoing off the walls. I'm a daughter, and this is about the New Year's Eve when I learned that my mother's excitement would always matter more than my boundaries, no matter how clearly I set. I found out I was pregnant in mid-December, early, like barely past the point where it felt real, and my partner and I had been trying, so it wasn't a surprise exactly, but it was still this fragile thing I wasn't ready to share, and the idea of telling people before we'd gotten through the first trimester made my chest tight. I told my mother because she's my mother, and because I knew she'd be hurt if she found out later that I'd kept it from her, but I also told her very clearly that I wasn't ready to tell anyone else yet. Not family, not friends, not until we'd gotten past 12 weeks and things felt more certain. She said she understood, and she hugged me and cried a little and promised she'd keep it between us, and I believed her because I wanted to, and because she'd said the right words in the right tone, and I didn't have a reason not to trust her yet. She asked a few questions about how I was feeling and whether we'd told my partner's family, and when I said no, not yet, she seemed proud, like I'd chosen her first, and that meant something. New Year's Eve came a couple weeks later. My mother had invited us to her place for a family gathering. Nothing huge, just aunts and uncles and a few cousins, and the kind of event where everyone eats too much and drinks sparkling cider out of champagne flutes and pretends midnight is more exciting than it actually is. I said yes because refusing would have required an explanation I didn't want to give, and because my partner thought it would be fine, and because honestly, I thought I could manage one evening without anyone noticing anything different about. I spent the first part of the evening focused on small things, keeping my sparkling water in a champagne flute so no one would notice I wasn't drinking, avoiding the cheese plate because someone had mentioned unpasteurized brie and I didn't want to risk the question, smiling through conversations about resolutions and pretending my nerves were just holiday fatigue. My body didn't feel like mine yet, but I wasn't showing, so I thought I could keep it quiet a little longer. And honestly, it felt good to have this one thing that was just mine, and my partner's for a bit longer before it became everyone else's business. Around 10:30, my mother started acting different, not obviously, just little things. She kept steering me toward the living room where people had their phones set up for the midnight video, and she kept saying things like everyone's going to love this with a smile that felt too wide for the context. And I didn't understand what she meant, but dread started crawling up my spine anyway. The kind you feel before you have words for fry. I tried to brush it off and told myself she was just excited about New Year's or about having everyone together or about whatever else mothers get excited about at holidays. But my stomach was tight and my hands were cold, and I kept replaying her words in my head, trying to figure out what she meant by everyone's gonna love this, and I couldn't make it mean anything that didn't involve my pregnancy. I asked her what she was talking about, and she just laughed and squeezed my shoulder and said, "You'll see," and walked away before I could push harder, and the house was getting louder with people talking and laughing, and someone had turned the music up and I felt like I couldn't breathe right. My partner noticed, and he leaned over while we were standing near the kitchen and asked if I was okay, and I said I didn't know which was true, and I told him I thought my mother might be planning something, and he asked what kind of something, and I said I wasn't sure, but it felt wrong, and he said we could leave if I wanted to. But I didn't know how to leave without making it a thing, without answering questions about why we were rushing out before midnight, so I stayed and hoped I was wrong. At 11:50, people started gathering in the living room, and someone turned on the TV for the countdown, and someone else was fussing with phone angles, and my mother was buzzing around, making sure everyone had a drink, and adjusting the camera setups, and asking who was recording. She looked happier than I'd seen her all night, and the dread sharpened, but I kept standing there trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. I pulled her aside in the hallway near the bathroom, where no one else could hear, and I asked her directly what she was planning. She smiled at me like I was being silly, and said, "Just trust me, honey. It's going to be perfect." I told her no, and I told her I wasn't ready, and I told her we'd agreed to wait, but she waved me off and said it's too happy to hide and walked back into the living room before I could stop her, and I stood there in the hallway for a few seconds, trying to decide if I should leave right then, if I should grab my partner and make up an excuse and just go. But then I heard people calling for me to come back for the countdown, and I didn't know what else to do. My partner looked at me across the room, and I could see the question on his face, so I shook my head slightly, trying to signal that I didn't know what to do, that I felt trapped by the momentum of the moment and the weight of all those people waiting for midnight. He started moving toward me, but my mother was already tapping her glass, and I felt my throat close up. The countdown started, and everyone was shouting 10, 9, 8 with voices rising, and phones lifted, and my mother standing at the center of the room with her glass raised, smiling at me like she was about to give me a gift. 7, 6, 5, and I felt my partner's hand find mine, and he squeezed once, hard, like he was trying to anchor me, and I remember thinking maybe she wouldn't do it. Maybe I'd misread the whole thing and she was just excited about the new year. 4, 3, 2, and my mother's smile got wider, and she looked right at me. In 1. Everyone shouted Happy New Year, and glasses clinked and people hugged, and in the middle of all that noise, my mother tapped her glass again, louder this time, and the room started to quiet, and she said, I have the most wonderful announcement to make. Faces turned, and I couldn't move, and I couldn't look away. My hands went numb. She looked directly at me, still smiling, and said, my daughter is pregnant. We're going to have a baby in the family. For a second, nothing happened. Like the words hung in the air and no one understood them yet. But then the room exploded with cheering and clapping, and someone screamed, and my aunt rushed over and grabbed my hand and said, oh my God, congratulations, and more people swarmed. And someone else was hugging me, and I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stood there while it happened around me. I heard my partner say something beside me, but I couldn't make out the words over the noise, and my mother was beaming from across the room, accepting congratulations like she'd just announced her own news. And I don't know how to describe what I felt, except that I'd asked her not to do this, and she'd done it anyway. And now I had to stand here and smile. People kept asking questions. When was I due? Did we know the gender yet? Were we excited? Had we told my partner's family? And I opened my mouth, but nothing came out at first. And then I heard myself saying things like early August, and not yet. And yes, very excited, and my voice sounded normal, but I felt like I was watching myself from somewhere else, like I'd split in half, and the part of me that knew how to be polite. My mother came over and hugged me, and she whispered, see, everyone's so happy for you, and I felt my throat close up because I didn't know how to explain that their happiness didn't erase what she'd done, that she'd stolen something from me and wrapped it in celebration, so I couldn't even be angry without looking ungrateful. Someone handed me a glass of sparkling cider and said we had to toast properly, and my partner was beside me with his hand on my back, and I could feel the tension in his fingers, but his face was calm, and when someone asked if he was excited, he said yes and smiled, and I was grateful he knew how to do that because I wasn't sure I could. The questions kept coming, and my cousin wanted to know if we'd picked names yet, and my uncle asked if we were hoping for a boy or a girl, and someone else asked if I was having symptoms, and I said just tired, which was true. But what I didn't say was that the exhaustion had nothing to do with the pregnancy, and everything to do with the pregnancy, and everything to do with standing in that room, pretending I was fine. Around 12:15, my mother brought out champagne for everyone, and sparkling cider for me, and she made another little toast about new beginnings and family growing, and I had to stand there holding my glass while everyone clinked and drank and looked at me like I should be glowing with happiness. My face hurt from smiling and my feet hurt from standing in heels I'd worn, because I thought this was just going to be a normal family party, and the air in the room felt thick and hot, and I wanted to leave so badly, but I didn't know how. Around 12:30, people started to drift. Some relatives had to drive home, and others were getting tired, and gradually the noise died down, and the living room emptied out. My partner asked quietly if I was ready to go, and I nodded. But then my mother appeared beside us and said, stay a bit longer. We haven't had a chance to really talk, and I didn't know how to say no without explaining why, so we stayed. She made tea, decaf for me, she said, smiling like that was thoughtful instead of presumptuous. And we sat at her kitchen table, and she asked about doctor's appointments and whether we'd scheduled an ultrasound and if we needed anything. The whole time I kept waiting for her to acknowledge what she'd done, to say something like, I hope it was okay that I shared, or I know you wanted to wait, or anything that showed she understood she'd crossed a line. But she never did, and she just kept talking about how excited everyone was, and how this was the best New Year's gift the family could have gotten. I sat there drinking tea I didn't want, and answering questions I wasn't ready to answer, and the kitchen light was too bright, and I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, and the refrigerator humming, and I wanted to leave, but I didn't know how. Around 1:30, I finally said we needed to go, and my mother hugged us both at the door and told me to call her tomorrow with updates. And I said okay, even though I had no intention of calling, and we walked to the car in silence. My partner didn't start the engine right away, and he just sat there with his hands on the wheel, and then he looked at me and said, are you okay? I wasn't, but I didn't know how to explain it yet, so I just said, "Can we talk about it tomorrow?" And he said yes, and we drove home without speaking. And I spent the whole ride replaying the moment over and over, trying to figure out if I'd overreacted, if maybe she'd been right, and I was just being anxious about something that was supposed to be happy, if the fact that everyone else seemed thrilled meant I was the problem. I didn't sleep that night, and I kept replaying her face when she'd made the announcement, the way she'd looked right at me while she said it, the smile that didn't match what she was doing. I kept trying to figure out what I should have done differently. If I should have made a scene, if I should have pulled her aside earlier in the evening and been more forceful about not wanting her to say anything. But every scenario I ran through in my head ended the same way, with me looking like the bad guy. By morning, I'd half convinced myself maybe it wasn't that bad, and maybe I was being too sensitive because people did seem genuinely happy, and nobody had acted like the announcement was inappropriate or badly timed, so maybe the problem was just me and my need for control. My partner woke up around 8 and found me on the couch, and he asked if I'd slept, and I said not really, and he sat down beside me and waited until I was ready to talk. I told him I didn't know if I was allowed to be upset that everyone had seemed so happy and my mother had seemed so proud. And maybe I was making too big a deal out of it because in the end, what difference did it make if they found out on New Year's Eve or 2 months from now? He was quiet for a minute, and then he said, "You told her not to. That's the part that matters." I started crying, not dramatic sobbing, just tears I've been holding back since midnight. And he put his arm around me and didn't try to fix it, and he just let me sit there and feel it. The next few days were strange, and my phone kept buzzing with texts from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months wanting to congratulate me and ask questions, calls from my mother's friends who'd heard the news, messages asking when we were having a baby shower, if we'd started a registry, whether we needed help with anything. Every notification felt like another reminder that my mother had forced me into a spotlight I hadn't agreed to stand in, and I didn't know how to respond to any of it without sounding ungrateful or difficult. I answered some texts with short thank yous and ignored others, and my partner ran interference when people reached out to him instead, because he was angry too, I could tell, but he was waiting for me to decide how to handle it, and I appreciated that because I didn't know yet. My mother called on January 2nd, and she asked how I was feeling, like nothing had happened, like we hadn't had that moment in the hallway where I'd told her not to say anything, and she'd done it anyway. I kept my answers short, and she didn't seem to notice. Or if she did, she didn't comment on it. She said, "Wasn't New Year's Eve wonderful? Everyone's still talking about it." I didn't respond, and my stomach hurt, and I was staring at the kitchen counter, at the coffee ring I hadn't wiped up yet, at the mail piled up that I hadn't opened, trying to figure out what to say. She kept going and said, "I'm so glad I could share that moment with the family. It felt really special. And your aunt already asked about throwing you a shower. And I told her we'd figure out dates once you're further along." I don't know how to describe what happened except that I'd been waiting for her to say she was sorry or that she understood why I might be upset. And instead, she was talking about it like she'd done me a favor. And I realized she wasn't going to apologize. That in her version of the story, she was the hero who'd made everyone happy, and I was supposed to be grateful. I told her I had to go, and she said to call her later in the week with any updates from my doctor. And I said maybe and hung up. 3 days later, my cousin called, the one who'd been standing next to my mother during the announcement, and she wanted to talk about baby names, and did I have a registry yet? And then she said something that made me tense up. She said, "Your mom is so sweet, you know. The way she announced it at midnight was just perfect, like she gave everyone this gift to start the year." I was standing in my kitchen holding a mug of tea that had gone cold, and I couldn't speak for a second because I didn't know how to respond without sounding bitter or ungrateful. My cousin kept going and said she told me she'd been dying to share the news, but she waited until the perfect moment. She's just so excited to be a grandma. I heard myself say, "Yeah, it was definitely a moment." She laughed and said, "You must have been so surprised. I bet you didn't expect her to do something that sweet." And I felt it then. If I said I'd asked her not to, I looked controlling. And if I said I wasn't ready, I looked ungrateful. And if I said anything honest, I became the villain who couldn't appreciate her mother's love and excitement. So I just said it was definitely a surprise and let her take that however she wanted. After we hung up, I stood there for a long time staring at my phone, and I was shaking, but not from cold. From anger I didn't know what to do with yet, because my mother had stolen my moment and somehow turned it into evidence of how caring she was. And now I had to either play along or look like the bad guy. My partner came home and found me still standing there, and he asked what was wrong, and I told him about the call, and he got very quiet, and then he said you don't have to protect her version of what happened. But I didn't know how to do anything else yet. A week after that, my mother called again and asked if she could come over that weekend to drop off some maternity clothes she'd found at a consignment shop. I said we had plans, and she said, "Oh, that's okay. I'll just leave them on your porch." And I said fine, because I didn't know how to say no without starting a fight I didn't have energy. Saturday afternoon, she texted that she was on her way, and then 20 minutes later, she knocked on the door instead of leaving the clothes on the porch like she'd said. I opened the door because I didn't know what else to do, and she was standing there with 2 big bags and a huge smile, and she said, "I know you said you were busy, but I just wanted to give you these in person." She came inside before I could stop her and started pulling clothes out of the bags and holding them up and talking about how cute they were and asking if I liked them. And I stood there feeling trapped because she'd said she was just dropping them off, but now she was in my house and unpacking bags and settling in like she was staying for a while. My partner came out of the bedroom and saw what was happening, and I could see him trying to figure out if he should help or if that would make it worse. My mother turned to him and said, "Don't you think this one would be perfect on her?" and held up a maternity dress that was way too formal for anything I'd actually wear. And he said, "Yeah, it's nice," in a flat voice that meant he was as uncomfortable as I was. She stayed for almost an hour and kept asking questions about the pregnancy and whether we'd thought about nursery colors and if we needed help with anything. And the whole time I kept thinking about how she'd said she was just dropping things off and how she'd come inside anyway and how she'd ignored what I'd said about being busy. When she finally left, I sat down on the couch, and my partner sat next to me and said she's not going to respect any line you draw unless you enforce it, and I knew he was right, but I didn't know how to do that yet. By mid-January, my aunt called, the one who'd grabbed my hand at midnight, and she asked how I was doing, and I gave her the same polite answers I'd been giving everyone, but then she said something that stopped me. She said, "Your mom's always been like this, you know. She gets excited and she just runs with it. She doesn't really think about whether other people are ready." I asked what she meant, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. She hesitated and then said she announced my engagement before I could tell my own parents. Threw me a surprise baby shower when I'd specifically said I didn't want one. She means well, but she doesn't really hear the word no when it conflicts with what she wants. I sat down even though I hadn't been standing near anything, and I just needed to sit. She kept talking and said, "I'm not saying you should forgive her or anything. I just wanted you to know it's not you, it's how she is. She genuinely thinks she's helping." After we hung up, I sat there for a while trying to figure out how I felt. Lighter because someone else had said it, someone who'd known my mother longer than I'd been alive. But also heavier because it meant this wasn't going to change, that my mother would keep doing this unless I found a way to keep myself safe from it. I told my partner what my aunt had said, and he asked what I wanted to do. And I said I didn't know yet, but I knew I couldn't keep giving my mother the same access I'd given her before. I started pulling back, not loudly, just quietly, and I stopped calling as often and stopped sharing updates without being asked first. When she texted to ask how I was feeling, I'd say fine and leave it at that. And when she wanted to know if we'd scheduled an ultrasound, I told her we'd let her know. She noticed, but she didn't push at first, and maybe she thought I was just tired or hormonal or busy. We found out the gender in late February, a girl, and my partner and I told his parents first, and then our close friends, and we waited almost a week before telling anyone else. My mother found out when someone mentioned it in a group text with extended family. She called me within 5 minutes, and I was folding laundry, and I saw her name on the screen, and I almost didn't answer, but I did. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I kept folding and said we've been busy, but everyone else knew, and I had to find out in a group chat. I didn't say anything, I just kept folding and waiting, and the dryer was humming in the background, and I could hear my partner in the other room on a work call. She said, "I'm your mother. I should know these things first." I said, "You showed me what you do with information I give you." Silence on the other end, and then she said, "That's not fair." I was just excited. I said, "I told you not to tell anyone, and you told everyone, so now you find out when everyone else does." She tried to argue and said I was holding a grudge, that I was being unfair, that she'd only been trying to celebrate with me, that I was punishing her for caring too much. I didn't fight back, and I just said, "I'm not interested in debating this. You can be upset if you want, but it's not changing." She hung up and called back an hour later and acted like the conversation hadn't happened, asked about my next appointment like nothing was wrong. I kept the line anyway and didn't explain because I didn't owe her an explanation. A few weeks later, she tried something different, and she called and said she wanted to surprise me with a baby gift. Could she stop by with it that weekend? And I said we had plans. She asked about the next weekend, and I said we'd let her know. 2 days later, my partner's mom mentioned that my mother had called her asking when our next ultrasound was, said she wanted to be there to support us. I stared at my phone after that call, ended because she was trying to go around me, trying to get information from other people when I wouldn't give it to her directly. I called her back and kept my voice calm, and I said if you want to know something about my pregnancy, you ask me. You don't call other people looking for information. She tried to laugh it off and said she was just excited, just wanted to help. I said you want access, you respect what I'm asking for. Otherwise, you get nothing. She got quiet, and then she said, I don't understand why you're being like this. I'm your mother, and her voice had that hurt tone that usually made me feel guilty and want to fix things, but this time I just felt tired. I said I know who you are, and I'm doing what I need to do. She didn't call for a week after that. Over the next few months, I learned what it felt like to keep myself safe from someone I loved, and it wasn't clean, and most days, it just felt sad and necessary at the same time, like choosing the least bad option when no good ones existed. My mother complained to other relatives, and a couple people reached out to tell me I was being too harsh, that she'd just been excited, that I should let it go because family was family. I listened politely and didn't change my mind. One cousin said I was being cruel, and that my mother was crying to her friends about how distant I'd become. I told her I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was just doing what I needed to do, but she didn't hear the difference. My partner asked me once if I felt guilty, and I told him constantly, but that I felt safer too, and I didn't know how to choose guilt over safety. The baby shower happened in April, and my mother came because other people invited her, but she wasn't involved in planning it, and she didn't get to make speeches or organize games. She was quieter that day, and part of me felt bad, but the bigger part knew this was what had to happen. She asked to be in the delivery room when the time came, and I said no, and she cried, and I held the line anyway, and didn't explain why, because I owed her an explanation for something she should have already understood. When the baby was born in August, we called her after we'd called my partner's parents, and after we'd had a few hours alone as a new family. She came to the hospital and held the baby and cried again, and I watched her carefully the whole time, waiting to see if she'd try to take a photo without asking or post something without permission, but she didn't. And I think she finally understood that access was conditional now. Nothing exploded, and there was no big apology that made everything okay again, and she never said the words "I'm sorry" in a way that felt real or that acknowledged specifically what she'd done wrong. My mother stayed in my life, but she wasn't in my inner circle anymore, and she got updates when I was ready to give them, and she got photos when I decided to share them, and she got visits when it worked for us. Some relatives still think I'm being cold, and a few people have told me that holding on to hurt isn't healthy, but I don't argue with them anymore, and I just keep doing what feels right, which is keeping myself safe, even when it makes other people uncomfortable. I stopped waiting for her to understand why what she'd done had hurt me, and stopped hoping she'd acknowledge it or apologize in a way that mattered, and I just accepted that she couldn't give me what I needed, and I built my life around, and instead of around hoping she'd change. My partner told me he was proud of me for holding the line, and that it wasn't easy to set limits with family, especially when everyone else wanted me to smooth things over. I told him it didn't feel like strength most days, and it just felt like the only option that didn't make me feel worse. But it worked, and my mother learned that her access to my life and my daughter's life depended on whether she could respect what I was asking for. And when she couldn't, she lost access. Not as punishment, just as what happens when you can't respect someone's limits. The kind that made sense in real life. The kind that made sense in real life. The kind that unfolded slowly instead of all at once. I think about New Year's Eve sometimes, and about the moment she raised her glass and took something that wasn't hers to give, and about the way she smiled while she did it like she was doing me a favor, and about how I stood there frozen while everyone celebrated news I wasn't ready to share, and how small I felt, and how small I felt, and how long it took me to trust that feeling instead of talking myself out of it. I don't regret pulling back, and I don't regret changing the information flow or making her work harder to stay in the loop. And I don't regret doing what I needed to do to keep myself and my family safe from someone who couldn't hear the word no when it got in the way of what she wanted. The baby's almost 2 now, and my mother sees her regularly, but always on our terms, and she doesn't get solo babysitting time, and she doesn't get to make plans without checking first, and she doesn't get to announce milestones or share photos without permission. When she pushes, which she still does sometimes, I remind her gently that this is how it is now. She doesn't like it, but she's learned to live with it, and I've learned that doing what I need to do doesn't make me a bad daughter. It just makes me someone who knows what she needs and isn't afraid to ask for it, even when asking makes other people uncomfortable. Thank you so much for listening to this one, and I know family stories like this can be complicated and messy, and I appreciate you sticking with me through it. If you've ever had to pull back from someone you love because they couldn't respect what you were asking for, I see you, and I hope you know you're not alone in that. If this story resonated with you, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button and consider subscribing. We upload new stories every single day at 3 p.m. Eastern, and I'd be grateful to have you back for the next one. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you tomorrow.